The anti-Black racism within our school system can be measured in a number of ways. But one of the most troubling examples is what's referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. That is when Black youth face more discipline and harsher penalties in schools than white students. As a result, it puts them in direct contact with law enforcement and potentially sends them down the wrong path and through the justice system.
Mass incarceration means that we've got a very high rate of incarceration historically, comparatively. And the other thing is the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically, it was 100 per 100,000. Now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about Black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of Black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated, and that's about 1 in 9. The research shows the kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out, and there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty. And we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
Did you know that the United States locks up more people than any other country on Earth? Although Americans make up only 4% of the world's population, 22% of the global prison population is behind bars in our country. Over 2.2 million people are incarcerated in the United States right now. That's more people than are killed by heart disease, cancer, tobacco, and diabetes combined each year. Friends, family, neighbors. Simply put, mass incarceration is one of the biggest issues facing our country today. But it hasn't always been this way. Over the past generation, the U.S. prison population has grown nearly 700%. And it's not because there's more crime these days. In fact, crime has been declining for 20 years, and we're safer today than at any point in a generation. What's driving mass incarceration? New policies that send more people to prison and keep them locked up longer. The cruel twist is that these policies can actually make us less safe. Sending someone to prison removes them from their families, jobs, and social supports, making it even harder for them to succeed and remain crime-free. And the longer the incarceration, the lower the chances of success upon release. A recent study found that each additional year of incarceration increases recidivism by 4 to 7%. In fact, study after study has shown that increasing incarceration rates doesn't make us safer. According to the National Academies of Science, which issued the most definitive research on incarceration to date, lengthy prison sentences are ineffective as a crime control measure. The reduction in crime can be attributed to a number of things, but today's historic and unprecedented levels of incarceration is not one of them. But this massive prison expansion is destabilizing communities. The communities most harmed by crime and violence are also the least supported by the criminal justice system.
According to the Madison School District, 57% of school suspensions in 2019 were given to Black students. Why is that? Large education gaps, poverty levels, and zero-tolerance policies are huge issues that affect Black education in Wisconsin. Today, we'll talk to one survivor of the school-to-prison pipeline and how they're using their story to help Black youth in Wisconsin. But first, let's explore why race matters when we talk about education. The landmark 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Even then, it wasn't until 1976 that federal Judge John Reynolds issued a court order to desegregate Milwaukee's public schools. However, Black students are still segregated by school policies. The 1990s saw ineffective zero-tolerance policies that led to the hypercriminalization of Black students. Yet school districts still pushed for extra precautions. In 2007, Milwaukee Public Schools brought police officers, known as school resource officers or SROs, to their district, which led to an increase in school arrests and citations. In Madison Metropolitan School District, Black students made up 81% of citations and 64% of arrests made by police between 2019 and 2020.
It's called the school-to-prison pipeline, and it's a national trend where children are funneled out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice system.
And we look at the children who is incarcerated. This child, a punishment for holding his food slot. He's being chained to the food slot. 16, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, pregnant women inside solitary incarceration. These photographs were taken by Professor Richard Ross of Berkeley, California. He has a project called Juvenile Injustice. And what he's showing is like how 12-year-olds are in solitary, how we have youth who are 18 and 16 left inside a cell with no items, how we chain our youth, devices of torture that are used to restrain children, like the Ethan Allen School in Wisconsin. This is a school considerably, but it's similar to a maximum security correctional facility. Here we have also in another cell in South Bend, Indiana, this is considered a schoolyard. So it's a cage with a little basketball court, and that's what it is for the kids. And we're talking about housing and torturing children.
Five Muallim Ak is now a prison reform activist and director of the Incarcerated Nation campaign. He spent 12 years in prison, and while incarcerated in New York State Prison, he spent 5 of those 12 years in solitary confinement for non-violent infractions. His activism has reached schools and universities nationwide. These images fill the walls of his office, reminding him every day of the difficult task before him in his fight for reform.
So if a kid acts out in school, we change suspension to incarceration. So literally, instead of suspending school kids or literally creating a system that has restorative justice, when I was young, if you act up, you had to write on the chalkboard, you had to help the teacher out, you had to do some type of remedial task that satisfied the environment in the school. That is no longer exists. Detention is another thing. The Board of Education is non-existent. You don't stay after school to take up classes. You go to jail. You go to prison. So the school to prison pipeline is basically shaping the school similar to a prison. We have armed guards. We have security measures that's close to like security going through the airport. You have to go to metal detectors. You have to be hand down, mat, wand, hand wands. You have metal detectors. You have cameras. We spent more money putting cameras in schools than we did in prisons in the last 5 years in America. And literally, we have probation officer. We have a police officer. We have a guidance officer. We have another officer inside the school. We have all these components, this system of containment, and children have to navigate. It takes them 20 minutes to navigate through this system of containment to get into the school. And once they get into school, they can walk right out the back door. Ain't nobody stopping them.
Five's son Shaquille recently graduated from high school and knows all too well about the challenges facing youth in public schools.
A lot of problems with the high school systems today is getting inside the high schools at first. Like, you're missing out on educational time just trying to get through security, just trying to get through the metal detectors, getting through armed guards, you know what I mean? Signing in, swiping your ID, you're late for your first period class, you're missing out on your education. And it's really intimidating. You know, it leaves the students with a sort of hostility. As soon as they wake up in the morning, people are tired. You know what I mean? We're coming in 7 o'clock in the morning, and you know what I mean, bright and early out of our beds to go through a hassle. Like, it's basically like airport security to get into your high school, you know what I mean? And it leaves kids messed up in the morning, feeling groggy and, you know, not even half awake.
Today, Shaquille works side by side his father at the Incarcerated Nation campaign. He is the director of youth services, where he aims to educate his peers and give a voice to youth at risk of incarceration. He tells me there is a direct correlation between the public school system and the prison system.
Deaf Street.